Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to talk about the final weekend of the play-ins for the 2023 season of the Overwatch League. We have the entire Eastern region play-ins happen this weekend, as well as the conclusion of the Western region play-ins. We have now all 8 of our playoff teams. We know what the brackets for the playoffs are going to look like, at least at the beginning of the brackets. So we'll get to those brackets at the end of this video. We're going to start by talking about the 3 teams that advanced to the playoffs. We're going to start by talking about the Boston Uprising, who won an incredible match over the Toronto Defiant in the upper bracket finals, the first Western region team to clinch through the play-ins. Generally speaking, the first play-in team to clinch for the postseason as well. 3-2, very close match against the Defiant, where they had to win on Circuit Royale, which we all know is the Defiant's favorite map. They love playing Circuit Royale, but Boston ultimately did pull out the win and were able to move on into the playoffs. Not really a surprise that they made it. Of course, they are the favorite, I think, of the teams that had to play through the play-ins. They were a top 4 team in the Midseason Madness. They're still a top 4 team in general when you look at the overall season standings. Arguably, one of the best teams in the league. Depending on what the meta is, they certainly have a chance to win the whole thing. They haven't looked amazing. They've struggled against a lot of the other top teams. They have a win against Houston, and I believe every game they've played against Atlanta and Florida have been losses, and I think they may have had another game against Houston in the first half of the season that they lost as well. So they only have one win against those top 3 teams in the league. So certainly there are some concerns, but I think depending on what the meta is and depending on how it shapes up, they certainly are a dangerous, threatening team, and they've been better than everybody else in the Western region and even in the East when you consider the way that the Midseason Madness went so far this season. So I don't really think there's a big shocker here that the Boston Uprising advanced. Tons of big names on this team. Tons of really great, phenomenal players. We expected this team to be good this year. I don't think they've, played below expectations. I don't think they've necessarily exceeded expectations. They've been what we expected them to be, which is a very good, very solid, top-of-the-league team. And yes, they unfortunately had to play in through the play-ins to get their playoff spot, but it was not particularly scary for them. The game against London Spitfire that they played in their first game of the play-ins, pretty convincing win there. All things considered, the game with Toronto was very close, was potentially a game that could have knocked them into the lower bracket, though I still think they would have moved on even if they were in the lower bracket. They're just a very good team. They're a very solid team all around. They have a bunch of clutch potential. I don't think they're a perfect team. I don't think they're a flawless team, but to me, the fact that they made it is just what you expected. It's not really something to kind of be shocked over or anything like that, right? You can say a lot of things of this Uprising team and their play this season. Like I said, their struggles against some of the top teams in the league, but they are one of the best teams in the league. I think the playoffs would have been bad if the Uprising weren't there, or at least it would have felt kind of empty, not having players like Lee J. Gunn and Izayaki and Twilight there, not having Smurf there, Decay not being there, Birdray not being there. There's so many legends on this team that this team not making it would have felt really bizarre and would have felt like a huge... If they didn't make it, it would have been a failure, right? This team would have been a massive failure if they did not make the playoffs. But they made it, so that didn't need to really kind of be the thing to worry about. I'll be interested to see what happens as we go into the playoffs. There's obviously the big rumors of the Zarya meta shift. If that does happen, does Kalios come in to play the Zarya? Do they make the decision to put Decay on Zarya? Does Smurf play Zarya? What does this team do? How do they kind of figure that out? So there's obviously that bit of intrigue to kind of watch out for with this team. But they've been really good. And I think that their ability to win the game against Toronto the way they did, that final map I think was a huge kind of glow up from them. That was a map they lost to Toronto in their matchup earlier in the summer stage. It was the only map that Toronto was able to win from that matchup. So it is a map that Toronto are very, very good on. It's one of the ones you kind of expect them to win. But Toronto not able to take it. Boston able to clutch up. And it was a good win for the Uprising. And huge congratulations to them. A lot of guys on that team that you really want to see succeed and do well. So happy for them. Excited to see them in the playoffs here in a couple of weekends. Up next, headline, the biggest shock of all of this play-ins is that the London Spitfire, who started the season 2-6, 2-7 after that loss to New York at the beginning of the summer stage, not only made play-ins, not as the bottom seed in the play-ins, but were able to pass the likes of the Washington Justice and the New York Excelsior to put themselves in a pretty solid position in the play-ins. They were able to get that win early on in the play-ins over, I believe it was San Francisco Shock that they beat in the first round. They lost to the Boston Uprising. Not a huge shocker there. And then were able to run a gauntlet, beating the Washington Justice, beating the Vancouver Titans, and then beating the Toronto Defiant to lock in the 8th and final spot in the playoffs. Absurd run from this team. Like I said, they started the season 2-6, 2-7. Like I said, with that loss to New York at the beginning of the summer stage. But it really felt to me like there were two games that really kind of defined this Spitfire season and really made the difference in them turning their season around, right? And the first of those games was the game they played against the Toronto Defiant at the end of the summer stage, the spring stage. I forgot they actually started 2-8 because they lost to Atlanta and New York in that first weekend. So you have this team that was able to beat the Toronto Defiant at the end of the spring stage. They had one win at that point in time. They felt like kind of dead in the water. Toronto had been struggling a bit, but you didn't think they would lose to London, and they beat them. And they beat them pretty convincingly. And I think that was the moment where I felt like London started to feel slightly different. They made changes. They, got rid of Lethal. They got rid of Sky Ripa. They brought in Sauna, and they were still trying some things out. They lose that game to New York. It feels like their season's probably over. And they come out the next weekend, and they beat the San Francisco Shock. They beat the LA Valiant. They just go on this honestly impressive run, beating the Gladiators, beating the Eternal. And it starts to feel different at that point in time, right? They didn't win every game beyond that point in time, but very, very, very good. Actually, they may have won every game beyond that. Incredible run from them. They had a phenomenal year. They won more games than I think people would have expected them to at that early point in the season. I think most people just thought this team was done, right? They lost to Houston to kind of end the season in the regular season. But the run they went on in this play-ins was nothing short of unbelievable. And just the second half of the season for them. This is a team, and it was a very similar story to last year. When you consider the number of games they played last season, they didn't make the first tournament of the year. They're pretty rough opening to the year in 2022, but they had a very good second half of the season, or a very good second stage of the season, right? So they didn't play amazingly in the first set, but they played much better in the second set of games, and they just kept getting better and better as the season progressed. And I think we're seeing that this is the same kind of thing with London. They look a lot better now than they did earlier in the season. They're playing very, very well. They look very good. I think you see some level of respect considering that the Seoul Infernal did not, picked them to be on the opposite end of the bracket. I think there's a lot of concerns and questions and, frankly, some weird things going on with the playoffs brackets. I'm not going to get into that here. I'll link to some stuff in the description if you want to see my thoughts on it and some other thoughts on it that I generally find to be pretty true. But the fact that London made it and the fact that they look as good as they do, and we know what they're going to play, right? They've been playing this Bastion, Sim, Rhine, Lucio, BAP, I think it is, for weeks now, right? For a month plus, right? They've been playing the same thing. You know what they're going to play, but they're so good at it. They're so coordinated. They just are so lethal on that composition that they are just able to find value fight after fight, game after game. And it really feels like this team turned their season around after that game against New York. And that win against the Shock, to me, really rebounded their season. And that was the game that they lose that game, they bottom out. They're done. There is no chance this team does anything. But they win against the Shock. And from there, they just keep rattling off win after win after win. And sure, they didn't play the greatest competition in the world in the second half of the season for parts of the season. But they still had to beat the Shock, right? They still had to beat the Defiant. And they still had to win the games in this play-ins bracket against teams like the Washington Justice, who looked really good with Alfie's Genji, and against the Vancouver Titans, who once again, sugar-free Genji, very good. A Toronto Defiant team that just a day before almost took the Boston Uprising down. So very impressive what this Spitfire roster was able to do, beating a ton of phenomenal players in this bracket. The only team they lost to in the play-ins was the Boston Uprising. And I think you have to really give a lot of credit to what this team was able to do, what Christopher was able to do with this team back-to-back years. He was Coach of the Year last year. I think he's definitely earned the right to be in the conversation. I know the award, or the voting for the awards is kind of over at this point in time for the majority of the teams. But this really is a phenomenal story to look at what London was able to do, how they were able to bounce back and really climb their way through and back up. And I think it's a testament to what this team is able to do and just how talented the players are and how talented the staff is. I think we are seeing quite possibly the best possible result here. This is a fully Western team. It is the only team in the league that is 100% Western players outside of the LA Valiant. And seeing them make it this far and in such a dominant fashion and such a phenomenal kind of run is really impressive. And I think you have to give a huge shout out to this team. I'm so excited to see them in the playoffs. They're going to add variety and spice that we maybe wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I think it's going to be really fun to see what they're able to do when the play-ins come around. But of course, there was one more team that had to clinch a spot, and that was the final team in the Eastern region. No real surprise there. It was the Dallas Fuel locking in that final playoff spot over in the Eastern region. If the rumors of Zarya being meta are true, definitely a team that is worth looking out for and worth watching. Hanbin on Zarya has been phenomenal in the past. And, to be fair, Hanbin on stage in Toronto, Dallas Fuel last year won the Summer Showdown in Toronto on the same stage they're going to be playing in the playoffs. This team did very well on LAN last year. They haven't played on LAN much this year. But they were a very good LAN team last year. Obviously, it's a different team now. No Chio, no Fielder. But they have improved a lot in the second half of the year. Very similar to London Spitfire in that way. I mentioned it when I was doing my Eastern region bracket predictions, but the Dallas Fuel have only lost to one team in the second half of the year. Since the beginning of the summer stage, the only team they lost games to was the Hangzhou Spark. The Hangzhou Spark seemingly just have the Dallas Fuel's number. Dallas struggles a lot against that Spark roster. But against every other team in the Eastern region, they were victorious. They beat the Infernal, they beat the Dynasty twice. They beat some teams that were good in, from the Contenders realm as well. So you have to give a lot of credit to what the Fuel were able to do. They have gotten good when they needed to get good. And like I said, if we are hitting a Zarya meta, which seemingly is where people think the meta is going, potentially could be going. At least Zarya is a viable pick, seemingly going forward. We've seen rumors of some players being signed to some teams for the ability they have to play the off-tank heroes. That is a dangerous combination. That could be the best possible playoff meta for the Dallas Fuel. So they are a team to look out for. They're a very scary team. They're certainly, I won't call them a dark horse to win the whole thing, because I think when you look at where the meta's going, if it, like I said, goes the direction we think it might, they feel like a team that should be good in a meta like that. So calling them a dark horse may be a little inaccurate, but certainly a team that is dangerous in the right circumstances and in the right compositions. They looked very good in the play-ins. They looked good, even generally speaking, in the summer stage, outside of their games against the Sparks that they lost. I think it's impressive what they've done. I think my feelings right now on this team are higher than the Infernal, for example, who go in technically as the highest seed in the Eastern region, even though most people didn't know that was the case. So we'll see what happens with the Fuel, but certainly a team I'm very interested in seeing how they play and excited to see where they go when they play on stage in Toronto. Next, before we talk about the playoff bracket a little bit, before I get that little preview, I want to just take a moment to talk about some of the players who did not make the playoffs this year, who we probably will not see again in the Overwatch League, or whatever the next iteration of the league is, in much of the same way that I think the transition from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 was kind of the closing of the door for a lot of people, a lot of players who decided that was kind of the best time to move on. I think we might see a very similar thing happen now, as there's the potential for the Overwatch League to disband and the changing of the guard for how the Overwatch esports realm is run. And so this weekend was probably, or at least possibly, the last time we saw some legendary players of the game play. There's a lot of players I could name, obviously, but I'm going to highlight some of the people who have been in the league since 2018, who, like I said, likely we will not see again. So Prophet, Void, of course, both on the Seoul Dynasty this past season. Prophet, 2018 Grand Finals winner, one of the greatest players of all time for the game. No playoffs for him this year, unfortunate. Only the second time he missed out on the playoffs, the other time being in 2021. Void, this is the first time Void is missing out on the playoffs, which really stinks, right? Void is a phenomenal player. Didn't get a lot of playtime this year, but I thought when he did, he looked phenomenal. I thought he looked very good. I thought he was a big part of this team when he got to play. And when his heroes were able to kind of get playtime, he felt like a very strong part of this team. His former tank partner, Fate, of course, another player who we will not be seeing in the playoffs. He played on the Valiant in 2018 and 2019, moved to the Mayhem for a few years. Then, of course, the past several years on the Dragons, a little stint on Panthera at the beginning of this year. Another phenomenal player, one of the best main tanks of all time. Really was a huge part of the success of the 2021 Dragons on their road to winning the final Overwatch League championship of the Overwatch 1 era. And another player that you just kind of want to really wish the best going forward. And then, of course, you have Striker. Boston to San Francisco, back to Boston, back to San Francisco, back to Boston, back to San Francisco. For him in his career, certainly a player who's had ups and downs, at least kind of in the perception of the community and the fans, but another player who I think back on 2018 Striker, I think he was one of the best players I've ever seen play. He was amazing again in 2019 when he got to play. In 2020, he was able to kind of bring himself back up. He got that Grand Finals MVP. I believe that was 2020 that he won that one. So, these are players who have been staples of the game for a long time. Like I said, there's tons of other players I could name. Jinmu and Xerneas are two people who kind of brought the really positive era of Chinese Overwatch in 2019 after the kind of disappointment of 2018, where a bunch of really good kind of Chinese players didn't get signed to teams, and you had that bad Shanghai Dragons roster, but Jinmu and Xerneas, two of those players, kind of helped usher that in 2019. And look, there's tons of other players who didn't make it who are legends of the game, but I think there is a really good chance that some of them will be back in the future. Like Proper's not done. I don't think Proper's done by any means. He's still got a lot left. I think a lot of the teams that we're not seeing going forward have a lot of players that we're still going to see, but some veteran people and some veteran players who we may have seen at the end of their careers this past weekend. And it stinks to see that, but you look to the future. Hopefully we have a lot of bright things going on in the future. We have a lot of kind of great moments and great players going forward. But definitely want to shout out some of the old guard, some of the best players we've ever seen, some of the greats of the game, who I'm thankful for getting to watch them play the game that I love. And so Shout out to all of them. And let's finally take a look at the playoff brackets. Like I said, we're going to look at them. I'm not going to give my predictions or anything like that, but I want to at least show you all the brackets so you can kind of get a look at them. So you can see there's bracket A and bracket B, or bracket 1 and bracket 2. Bracket 1 is the top bracket. You can see the Hangzhou Spark will be taking on the Atlanta Reign as the first game in that one. And then the Boston Uprising on the London Spitfire. That to me seems like the more confusing bracket. Obviously, there were some weird things going on there with the Infernal, who had the first pick on who they wanted to send over to that bracket, choosing the Spitfire. Uprising ended up on that side of the bracket as well, which is interesting. I think you would feel most likely, based on the season so far, Boston and Atlanta probably the favorites there, but we don't know for sure what to expect, so there's definitely some potential for other things there. And we'll see if there's any roster changes as well that get announced between now and then. That could change our opinion on things there. And then in the second bracket, you have the Dallas Fuel taking on the Seoul Infernal, which I think is a very interesting matchup. Meta depending, right? Depending on what meta you get, really depends, or changes what happens, right? If it's a really strong Zarya meta, you feel a lot better about Dallas. If it's a really strong Winston meta, you feel a lot better about the Seoul Infernal. And then you have the Houston Outlaws and Florida Mayhem, which is a banger to start the first bracket there. I think they're the favorites to get out of that one, but if it's a Zarya meta, Dallas only has to beat one of those teams to move on potentially, so it would be interesting to see there. Like I said earlier, I have some thoughts on the bracket and the playoffs in general, so I'll link to some tweets in the description if you want to check those out, just for a little bit more kind of hearing me and other people's thoughts on the bracket, where the things that I think it doesn't do as well as I would like, I think having a third place game is a little odd. When it just feels like at that point in time, like you're playing for money, which I guess is nice, but like the game at that point in time is not going to be as interesting. But maybe the teams will care a lot, and they do want to get that third place. They do want to get that extra money because money's money, right? And you are going to play to win. But we'll see what happens there. But that's it for this one. That is it for most of the season now. We're down to the final 8 teams. Playoffs will be happening here in a couple weeks, so I'm going to have my videos on that when they come out. Obviously, between now and then, you can expect award stuff, MVP, Roll Stars, all that type of stuff. I got those lists compiled for you. I am ready to go, so those will be coming out here in the next couple of weeks. Before we get to the playoffs, and then, of course, playoff predictions will happen. Then we'll recap the playoffs, and then we'll be done with the Overwatch League season. We'll look ahead to the World Cup. But let's not get ahead of ourselves too much. Let's focus on living in the moment and taking it day by day. So that's going to be all for me for today. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. As always, your support is greatly appreciated. Comment down below your thoughts on anything that happened this past weekend, your thoughts on the playoff format, whatever it is. Love to hear from you in the comments down below, but that's all for me. Once again, hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.